friends, this is Trish, and welcome to Teacher Therapy. Today we have a very special guest named Betty Roberts, and she has been in education for over 50 years. She also has experience all over the world. She's taught in Germany and Japan and multiple states in America, and I cannot wait to hear about all of her stories and insights. But before we get to all those great stories, I would love to know what has been some of your biggest struggles over the years as a teacher?
Well, I think the biggest challenges, is the growing ideology of remediation. And it's to the point of indoctrination at this point. And this, I think, resulted in low expectations of students and now has become the fixed mindset. That's probably my biggest challenge over the years. So I've seen this decline over the years, but I never changed my thinking on this perspective. I still maintained high expectations regardless of the background of students. And I wanted students to experience the printed word versus their own background. And that started to change, particularly when the Common Core started coming in and the curriculum became scripted. So, however, I never had any problem sneak teaching, and I had wonderful colleagues that supported me on this. And over time, this mindset clashed with administration and even colleagues over this mindset. And I think probably the first time this really hit me is when I taught in a very radical inner city, and where that was really set up to fail. And I still had the same high expectations of students regardless. I really wasn't interested in their socioeconomic status. I didn't feel like it was my job to be the parent or a therapist. It was my job to educate them and students to see the value of education as their future. However, I was told that you cannot impose these values on students. They just can't do it. It's too difficult and it's too white. So that was probably, in my opinion, the worst form of racism imaginable. In other words, it's maintaining an underclass. I had no problem speaking up about this problem. But this really changed my philosophy of education, and it created a lot more self-awareness. But I decided to resign from that position because I just was not a good fit, and it was simply not safe. But this is where I saw a lot of brainwashing, mind control of students from staff. And so I decided this is something I just don't believe in, and I need to move on. So over the years, I still continued to support the high expectations, and I taught in another inner city school system, and as a Title I reading teacher. Again, the expectations were just the same. I did not consider them as struggling readers, and I still pushed for the critical thinking, analysis of text, bringing in their own experiences, loved their new ideas. And how I made this work was having learned from the previous inner city experience, I decided I'm going to call every parent of every student and introduce myself and introduce my discipline plan and the expectations. There was a daily chart which showed that they met requirements for the day. They brought their supplies, they turned in assignments, and they walked out the door looking at this chart to see if they met these daily requirements. And then plus, I sent home weekly progress reports to parents. So they knew exactly where their children stood. And this made a big difference in maintaining discipline in the classroom. And their self-esteem raised. They were excited to learn and excited to explore new ideas. And we had no issues discussing uncomfortable topics at times, because they were prepared for it. To me, this is part of the reading process. And so then a real game changer occurred. A colleague said, Betty, I think you need to become certified and gifted. These are the strategies that you use. And at that time, I never knew there was even such a program. So I was observed, and I went ahead and started taking the coursework. And unfortunately, due to the Reagan cutbacks, I was laid off. I was really devastated. It was probably one of the most rewarding teaching experiences of my career. So that went on through the 90s, and I became a gifted specialist for most of my career, and occasionally had to teach some reading classes and also social studies as well. Now, in one system here, as time went on, getting into the late 90s, There, I was starting to see a shift between, say, with respect, a lack of respect by administrators, lack of support by administrators, and even colleagues and counselors. So one of the stumbling blocks was I could not use visuals to support a civics program. Well, I did it anyway, and I found ways to get around it. And despite the other challenges, like I had to teach in an auditorium, there was a divider that because of the overcrowding. So I taught in an auditorium. There's a divider. So on the other side of that divider was a speech and drama class. So there are times we just simply I could not be heard. It was very difficult to teach. And I think the next thing too, I'm finding that in this particular setting, many colleagues came from Spanish-speaking countries, and English was not their first language. And there was still the mindset. And the number of students I had were either first and second generation Cubans, and they were still influenced by a totalitarian society, and they did not have the critical thinking skills that are important in American society. So this was a challenge, and from what I've read and what I've heard, it takes 2 generations to wipe out a mindset. So this was a huge challenge, plus serious disciplinary problems in this auditorium. It was very difficult to manage students with the noise. So I was assaulted once, and I had to see a doctor, but there was security found no probable cause to take any kind of legal action against that student. So then my car was vandalized a few times. I asked the administration to please lock the teacher's parking lot, but they refused to do so. And at that point, we're approaching the end of the year, and 75% of the students failed civics. So I provided students for a summer school program. And by the time that all that paperwork had been processed and submitted, summer vacation had started. And I was transferred to an inner city school, right in the school system that was actually safer for me.
Wow. Well, you've brought up so many fascinating points, and I'm really curious about one of the first experiences you had where the administration actually said your high academic standards and your Socratic methods and your focus on literacy was too white. Can you tell me more about that?
That is going back to to my second teaching job. This was in 1974 when I taught in an inner city. Went in excited, and that was my first experience of this kind of racism. To me, I grew up in a military family. We were accustomed to diversity, going back a long time. And I heard stories from my mother about how she experienced racism as a military spouse when my parents were stationed in the South. But I was just never really thought too much about racism, particularly because I was accustomed to diversity. But this incident at that particular school, too difficult and too white, that was really a turning point and a real game changer. I simply didn't know any other way. I thought that teaching was teaching, and my goal as a teacher was to instill the importance of literacy and improve their lives and get out of the situations they were in. And when teaching in Baltimore, as the Title I reading teacher, I did not experience this with administration or teachers, and so that there was a huge difference. And of course, they were talking 14 years later. And the students actually saw the relevance of education, how it could improve their lives and break this cycle of spiritual and economic poverty. This is the only way out.
Absolutely. I agree with what you're saying so much. And it's just amazing to me that this problem is so old, because I think a lot of us kind of wondered if there's been a modern resurgence in some radical ideologies that are actually holding down students of color. But it's so interesting that the seeds of this were happening back in the 70s. And you kind of mentioned in that particular school, kind of feeling like the administration and maybe some of the teachers were sort of radicalizing or indoctrinating their students. What did that look like on a day-to-day basis?
What I experienced was when they would come to me, my whole philosophy or approach to teaching was completely different than other colleagues. They tend to stick to like a prescribed curriculum with worksheets, reading to get the main idea, details. But I saw reading as more, there was more to reading than that. And I think, and this goes into, as today, going into test scores, I don't think a lot of the testing is even relevant to students today. And one of the things that I've just kind of noticed that now, that schools are now becoming more totalitarian, or more it's becoming more and more dictatorial. And I feel like that was not in a democracy, and where the way the school was run, it was the principal started controlling staff members coercively. And this was starting to become very scary and become more totalitarian. There was like a select group of staff members that kind of ran the show and would tattle on others.
Yeah. And I'm kind of curious too. There's been a lot of debates about certain books being banned, or there's been ideas that certain books, if the authors are white, we can't read them with students of color. Have you ever experienced that? Because I certainly experienced it as a teacher.
Well, going to challenged books, I really did not experience any issues with the racial issues specifically in books. However, when I've taught in the Department of Defense schools, in one school, that as the gifted resource teacher, I supported the curriculum with classics, included banned and challenged books, and parents had to authorize this. And some of the books I used were To Kill a Mockingbird, Lord of the Flies, Animal Farm, and Night. Those were some of the selected books. And they, for the most part, and also want to add in the book The Kite Runner. That was probably the most controversial. And I thought it was relevant because when I was teaching in Germany, many of our troops were stationed in Afghanistan. And I wanted students to see there was more to Afghanistan than what they're hearing on the news and from the military perspective. And that it was actually presented in a workshop. And I asked the presenter, I said, is it okay if I use this book with fifth grade gifted students? He said, sure, it should be fine. And he gave some ideas on how to teach it. And it got into women's issues. It got into their racial issues, their class society, and the abuse of children and women. But that wasn't the focus of the book. If that was all that was the only thing they were concerned about, then their heads in the sand, they're missing the point. And so I didn't encounter a parent whose child I didn't even teach, who was an aide at the school, saw one of my students carrying a copy of The Kite Runner around, and she complained to the district superintendent, and I got a letter of reprimand to discontinue that immediately. And a letter of reprimand stays in your file for 2 years. So, however, I spent the summer challenging this, trying to get it removed. And then finally, I contacted the base commander, and 3 days later, that letter of reprimand was removed from my file.
And did you have any other kind of run-ins with administrators about your curriculum or your teaching style or some of the ideas that you had?
Yes, particularly the last 3 years. And so we're kind of moving in the direction of identifying like workplace bullying, but it's now moving into like coercive control. And it's based on a model by an expert who devised what was called the BITE model. It's an acronym for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotion control. This is an evaluative tool to determine whether or not you are being coercively controlled in a school by whether it's teachers or whether it's administration or any parents or even students. And so I'm going to break this down because to make this clearer, so other teachers, if they study this evaluation tool, they will be able to determine, and we're trying to get legislation passed to end this. So B stands for behavior. In other words, to instill obedience. Just like in a cult, you had to have permission for lessons, to show movies, use books. And individualism was discouraged, especially now with the scripted curriculum. The idea to deviate from that curriculum was considered defiance and simply defiance and being difficult. Extremely rigid rules, just very rigid rules. A lot of micromanagement, tattling, shunning, and in federal employment, they have what they call PAIs if you are in trouble, and that stands for pre-action investigation. So it's not just the Department of Defense schools, but also other government agencies as well. And I had never heard of that until my last 3 years. So this often resulted in letters of caution, which is in the file for a year. A letter of reprimand would be there for 2 years, and then emails, memos of expectations, all disciplinary. I had never experienced so much disciplinary action towards me in the 50 years. That last stop. Now, I stands for information control, which involves close censorship. This is where I had the issues with the challenge books, and that was information outside the scripted curriculum. Also restricting outside perspectives. So in other words, this interventionist mentality versus critical thinking. And they kept us busy with so much outside tasks that there really wasn't time to be doing a whole lot of investigating, filing grievances. Of course, this happened. I filed a lot of them, and spying, tattling, reporting views of differences of opinion, what would be viewed as deviant, and this is what I call is becoming more like an oligarchy. In other words, a few people were running the show. Transgressions alleged by the principal, ongoing, and she would throw in past aggressions from 2 years before continuously. There was never any, she would never let it go. Gossip, perceived transgressions based on hearsay. Misquotes. I was simply got in trouble for doing my job, following the guidelines of the gifted program and enforcing discipline. And defamatory narratives when written up with no support from the union. Okay, thought control, black and white thinking, us versus them, gaslighting and loaded language, belittling, divide and conquer, thought stopping, punishment and compliance, criticizing the leader or policy, and conformity was definitely expected. So victim blaming was never the fault of the leadership or the group, so to speak. So they promoted unworthiness. The administration would love bomb somebody to pit people against each other, and instill fear by manipulation, shunning, disapproval, and just excessive meetings, constant. I think I experienced somewhere between 8 and 11 of these PAIs in 3 years. So anyway, so this is an evaluative tool that somebody could use if they feel like that they are being controlled coercively. And this really, it's really probably more effective than referring to it as bullying, because it's more definitive.
Absolutely. And I'm just kind of curious. So in this particular environment, was the main problem that they just wanted you to follow a canned curriculum and a canned script and just kind of leave it there, and they noticed that you were doing different things, and that's why they kind of targeted you? What do you think was at the heart of why they were so against what you were doing?
Well, this kind of goes back. I am guessing that this started the first year of the administration. I did not have any issues, anything significant. I kind of had a feeling trouble was coming, but at that first year, and that was my year, I facilitated a TEDx youth event. So that was an honor for our school, our community, and for the entire military community in Germany. So this was live streamed, and the students had to prepare their speeches over a year. This involved a lot of finding sponsors, organizing locations where to have the event, and what was difficult was it was during COVID. So we had some issues. I had to fill out a lot of paperwork to get permission to get it live streamed in an auditorium. And that according to TED guidelines, they requested that this event not be on a military base, but because of COVID, and every place was closed in Germany, there was no place to hold it. So because of COVID, and so I got permission to hold it in the high school auditorium where they had the facilities to live stream. So parents could watch from the could watch it from a screen because we were not allowed to have a live audience. But since then, it seems like right after that event, immediately in the next school year, when the next school year started, I was targeted. It was, and I could not understand why. It was just one thing right after the other, and that was probably the turning point. And that's like, and then we started getting into a situation where a few select people were allowed to not follow the scripted curriculum, but other people were. So as a sneak teaching, I would have students read the short reads, and they had to do additional research to find out what information is missing. What do you need to know? So this was probably to me, I think, was the most challenging part of that scripted curriculum because it left out key details, really the essence of issues.
Interesting. And could you kind of give me an example of maybe what would be left out of the canned curriculum in some of the reading passages?
Yes. Well, in one of the passages, there was a unit called the corn unit. It was so there was it went into the history of corn throughout the world and how it was spread and the nutritional value, how cost effective it was. But there was no mention of the Columbian exchange. So I had students research that, and they figured out for themselves that was a key point that should have been mentioned in that read, in that unit. Not once mention of the Columbian exchange.
Why do you think that would upset your administrators, having you do additional research and getting students to think critically?
Because they wanted to keep it scripted. There would be no controversy. Of course, when I did that activity, I did that with an entire class. And I worked with the classroom teacher ahead of time. We would co-plan. And I said, this is, to me, I think this is, they need to research this information and determine what is left out. It's called critical literacy. So that, I didn't get caught on that one. But what happened was I was in passing with the principal. She stopped me and said, you will stick to the scripted curriculum. There will be no TEDx, there will be no debate, there will be no book studies, and there will be no Socratic seminars. Only that curriculum. And I felt that this was cheating our gifted students, was not meeting their academic needs. And I was directed, do not pull them out of the room. You have to do it within the classroom. And there was nothing in the guidelines saying we could not take them to another location. And there was nothing in the guidelines saying we could not supplement. Well, I continued to sneak teach, and I did get caught. And then I showed I used the social studies curriculum was the Western Hemisphere. And then they addressed the issues of Native Americans from a variety of perspectives, not only in North America, but also included Central America, South America, Canada. And I had my advanced students read The Pearl by Steinbeck. And the principal walked in and looked over and noticed this. And I thought, oh, I'm busted. So she called me out on it, but I just said, according to the guidelines here, it says we are allowed to supplement. And so I stated all the standards, all the objectives, and she got off my back on that one, at least for a while anyway.
That is so interesting. It just seems to me like an administrator would love a teacher that's challenging students to think critically, that's enriching their learning, that's finding relevant outside materials and experiences. That literally sounds like a dream teacher, but I know in reality that they don't want that. And it's so frustrating. And so I'm just wondering, did you feel your joy as an educator start to drain once all of these obstacles started coming up?
No, I still maintained my passion as a teacher. I still loved working with the students and colleagues who supported me. I saw this as a challenge, and I thought, well, I'm approaching retirement. I get caught. Well, I will get a letter of reprimand. I will get for not following directions, insubordination. It did happen. And I felt like the students always came first. And if I had to sneak teach to do it, so be it. And I did it all the time. Wow. However, the problem was that I had the occasional colleague that decided, one of them, and one of her and the grade level team member decided they were going to smear my name in the community because they objected to the challenge material I was bringing in and enriching students. So the allegations came from them, then with the principal, that I was causing students too much stress and they were not performing well in the classroom and that they were assigned too much work. So this person who instigated that kind of almost behaved like a cult leader, was able to draw people in. And this almost ruined an entire grade level of gifted students. So that, because the parents then would not talk to me and discuss their concerns. So it was this was also, say, a form of manipulation. And that was very, very frustrating how one person could actually pull this off and get away with it. And whenever I filed a grievance on that, addressed it with the principal, an EEOC issue, I was retaliated against by the principal. She saw no problem with this, and it was okay to be treated that way.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that you went through that. I went through something very similar my third year of teaching, and it feels like one of the most impossible situations when you've got somebody or a group of people that are turning the mob against you and then trying to turn students against you. It's the most impossible, frustrating feeling.
Yes, it was. But I was fortunate. I did have a few, and so I really was thought, wow, I am really being bullied at this school, and that I filed an EEOC complaint. I went up the channel. Unfortunately, the EEOC with the Department of Defense appears to be rigged, and I went through the process, and they would find a technicality why they would have to dismiss the case. So like with grievances, we go through the union. Well, there was 3 levels of grievances. You have the step 1 where you tell the principal that you're going to file. Then 2, you actually file it. Then she writes a rebuttal. Then you can't come to agreement. Then it goes to HR and the higher level superintendent. Most of the time, it never made it to the third level. They just simply did not follow through, and that was in the contract. No support from the union over this. And at one point, so after I retired, I went ahead and filed a congressional grievance. And the whole thing was like hundreds of pages. That was going back over a 3-year span. And then it made its way to the superintendent of DoDEA. And she just dismissed it, just simply said, well, at the second level, they still haven't made a decision yet. Well, they never made a decision.
That's pretty frustrating. I kind of can relate to that a little bit. I didn't take it as far because I was in a private school, but I remember outlining like a 7-page document of just the horrible things that were happening to me at this particular private school. And I had all of these specific examples, and I gave it to the head of school, and she just never replied to it. She never followed up. And then I was supposed to have basically the yearly teacher evaluation, and they literally just never gave me one. They just kept putting off the date, and finally the writing was on the wall, and I thought, you know what, I think that they're just going to fire me, so I might as well resign, because it's clear that they're not going to acknowledge anything that I'm saying, that they don't even want to give me an evaluation. I think they were just trying to figure out basically how to get me out without being sued, because so many of the things that happened to me were illegal. But I was, maybe 27 or 28 at that time. And, I didn't really fight for myself or advocate for myself. But I think it's a really good example of how even when you do all of the steps, you go to the union, you file complaints, you do everything you're supposed to do. I really do agree that a lot of times, most of the time, the system is rigged against the teachers, and they all stand up for each other. And then your co-teachers are probably afraid to join forces with you, because then they'll become a target of administration too.
I agree. And the punishment in the end, after all these grievances, all these EEOC complaints, the principal decided to reassign me as a reading math interventionist, the complete opposite of what I was doing. And this was as punishment, not in the best interest of children. And there were a lot of teachers there that wanted that position. However, I threw in a monkey wrench, because the math portion of it required certification as a comp ed math teacher. And I did not have the 5 college math courses required. I just happened to call certification for DoDEA and say, I am being have been reassigned as a comp ed reading and math teacher. You have to be certified and as a comp ed math teacher. They said yes. And so I brought that up. I addressed this with the principal, said, I'm not certified. Oh, it doesn't matter. You don't have to worry about that. And I was actually told by the union, they have the right, the principals have the right to assign, but however, several days later, she removed me from that position for my remaining weeks there. And I just went around and did class critical thinking lessons until I retired. In the meantime, she'd hired somebody from the States to replace me, which cost the government money, money that was unnecessary spending. So the way I looked at it, it was waste, fraud, and abuse.
Absolutely. And I'm just kind of curious, in your 50 years of educational experiences, how have you seen student behavior and attitudes and just their mindset toward authority change? Or do you think it's always been kind of hard and we're just seeing it more widespread?
Well, I think that there is more student behavioral problems, no doubt. It's kind of been a slow burn, and then we're getting less support from the administration. They would absolutely not support teachers. And I recall your last guest, Mr. Peterson, addressed this very nicely. If principals don't enforce policy, it really weakens our position, and we don't have much authority, and we don't have the control. So that was a very good point there, and that really hit home. But then as we did not get the support, it was always teacher blaming at all. Something wrong with our classroom management, that if we made lessons more exciting, that would make a difference. And of course, they were terrified of the parents in many cases. Now, but working in a military community, I really, for the most part, overall, I didn't have that many serious problems. There were a few, and it often depended on the rank of the sponsor. And if they were special forces or if they were high-ranking officers, yes, the parent complaints were taken more seriously. And colleagues, some were local hires whose spouses were high-ranking military, were high-ranking administrators in the school system or high-ranking federal employees. And they seemed to have a lot of clout in the school, and they did say there was a lot of like even helicopter parenting on their part too. And they were the ones that tattled. They were more likely to tattle if they didn't like something. But one incident with parents was when I had this outside duty where the students had to go through a gate and inside these double doors. And it was like 300 students. If it wasn't managed, there could have been a stampede. They were not allowed to run. They had to walk. And if they were running, I pulled them aside, and then they had to wait to enter the school last. Well, a parent complained to the principal, and I was told I cannot discipline the students at all out there. So I was very worried about safety issues, that if there's a stampede, some kid could get hurt. There were kindergarten kids entering the school with fifth graders, and some were pretty big. So I kind of devised another strategy that outsmarted the principal and the parent, even though she stood guard and watched me for several weeks every morning. And I was glad when my time was up with that duty for a while. And so that was probably one of the worst examples of that. But we're dealing with safety issues. And this was kind of a big problem at the school during that final 3 years. Cafeteria duty. Okay, I had there was a group of fifth graders that decided they wanted to play with food, squirt cherry tomatoes, and where the juice could have gotten in somebody's eye. There could have been liquid on the floor, and somebody could have slipped. And there were like 15 kids crammed at a table. And I reassigned seats, and a parent complained. So I was told that my relationship with students was unsatisfactory. And so there's an unsatisfactory performance element, not relating well to students. This was over safety. So I even contacted the parent first about a particular child who was playing with food, and the parent got very upset and contacted the parent. So another safety issue was was on the playground. I had first grade duty outside on the playground, recess duty, and so there were a group of fifth graders that were not supervised, and I asked them just to go back to their class because they were doing a science activity. And they got very, very mouthy with me, very, very obnoxious, and that they finally left. But then they complained that I was too hard on them. I got in trouble with the principal, And I was issued a letter of caution for a poor relationship with students, and the class and the teachers that were not held accountable for not supervising their kids.
Wow, that is crazy. And I'm curious, what were you doing that they considered to be too harsh? Was it just telling kids no and to stop doing what they were doing?
Pretty much it. And that really did not happen very often. When I had cafeteria duty, it was the safest cafeteria. It was I made sure that kids were safe. They were not allowed to run. That they had to stay at their seats. And during the COVID times, it was structured differently. And so we had longer lunch periods because we had to spread it out more. We had more duties for us. And if the rule was, one parent complained that they did not have enough time to eat. So I thought, well, we have a solution to this. They can talk up to the first 20 minutes, and then they have to eat in silence the last 5 minutes to finish, then go out for recess. And then so a couple of the classroom teachers came in and watched me and then tattled because that was considered not appropriate discipline. But I was simply following the directive of the principal. And then there was another issue with enforcement, with a no hat rule. We actually had a faculty meeting. We were to enforce the hat rules, no hats indoors. And there's always a few repeat offenders. And one I nailed, and then I followed him into his classroom, and I stood there and I told him, I said, you must remove that hat. And then he got very upset with me. And then the classroom teacher complained to the principal that I disrupted her class. So I got written up for that. So that was again, doing the job I'm supposed to be doing, enforcing rules and getting in trouble for it.
That is so frustrating. I remember having a similar situation where in our particular handbook, they said that students could not wear bandanas because especially it's kind of an area where there is some gang activity. And so especially with certain colors and certain patterns, you're just not supposed to have it. So I actually told a student that they needed to remove the bandana and she wouldn't do it. And it kind of became a silly power struggle. So I called, one of the assistant principals basically to kind of come deal with the situation because it was becoming a scene. And they actually sided with the student. And they said something like, oh, you must kind of feel like your hair doesn't look that great today. And that's why you want to wear the bandana, right? And of course, the student's like, yeah, that's exactly why. And so essentially another assistant ended up coming up. So now we have two assistant principals, the student and myself. They're all basically siding with the student. Then there's the whole classroom that's kind of listening in kind of through the door because we stepped outside to talk to the principals. And so the message that the students get is basically the teacher has no authority. Yeah. You cannot, enforce anything, even if it is something that is a safety issue. And I just ran into that all the time. And it's so frustrating.
Yeah, that's so this really, we lose a lot of our authority. When students know they can get away with this, there'll be no action taken. They're almost even rewarded for bad behavior. Now, fortunately, in my field, I did not. as far as whole classes, I did not experience too many discipline problems. Within I think it was more dealing with faculty. Like there was another incident where I had to cover her class as I was working with my small group of gifted as required by the principal in that classroom. And there were rotating groups. And the teacher left, and one just got out of hand from another group. And I addressed her. I said, there will be consequences if you don't stop talking. And so she started crying. And then I was called into the principal's office because she said, if you make a child cry, you are not professional. So it's misconduct on my part. So this was actually addressed 3 months after it occurred. I was called in for that. So I find that this started becoming pretty normal during particularly my last couple of years at the school. And that it was really frustrating because like doing the job I'm hired for, I'd get in trouble for doing it. And there was another case where I we had issues with identifying minority students. I knew exactly what to do. We had guidelines for that, and there would be reasons to deny minority students services, and that based on behavior and not performing in the classroom. And one we got identified because a rule changed, and then I was told He is not to be attending in your program for 2 months until we can figure out what was causing his behavior in the classroom. It's had nothing to do with me. So students are not supposed to be denied services based on behavior in the classroom.
So you're saying that you were basically looking for and assessing students to find out if they qualified for the gifted program, but if they were students of color, they would be denied, basically?
That happened a lot based on behavior in the classroom. That I'd like to think, it was based on race. I think it was. It was hard to specifically identify, but listening to like kind of microaggressions, implicit bias, that I could tell. But in fact, this is where we were at that time. DEI was in full force, and I was on the DEI task force for our school. Every school had to have a representative, and that we were expected to have a workshop, to conduct a workshop for DEI to make sure that students were getting the services that they qualified for in many different areas, not just gifted, but other services as well. And I was not allowed to provide that workshop. And then I wanted to teach a course in this area, and I was denied permission to teach the course because my records were not up to date.
Interesting. Wow. And I'm just curious, what were some of the other major challenges you experienced as a teacher, whether it was, teaching on military bases or before you taught overseas? What are some of the big themes that you kind of found showed up no matter what environment you were in?
I think for the most part that, again, the lower expectations versus my expectations, that seemed to be, not always, but whenever I did run into difficulty with the administration and colleagues, that was the issue. It would cause too much stress. The expectations were too high, not only just for gifted kids, but also regular ed students as well. That was probably the ongoing problem.
Yeah, I felt the same way as a teacher. And of course, I only taught for 8 years, but it was just this nonstop battle. And I ran into the same thing too with them randomly picking a curriculum, 5 months into the year and saying, stop everything you're doing, stop the novels, stop all the work you've been doing, and just take this really silly, simplistic, ridiculous curriculum and you have to follow it. So that was something like I kept switching schools. I switched schools 5 times, hoping that someplace, I could actually be a successful teacher. But I just felt like even if I flew under the radar for a few months, I feel like whether it was an instructional coach or some district change or something would always happen where they would come in and basically say, almost like you're doing too great of a job, you need to lower it and you need to make it more simplistic, or there's just something about what you're doing that nobody else is doing and we don't like it. So I can really relate. And it's still hard for me to understand why that is. But the only thing that I can think of is, one, it could be envy on the part of administrators and coaches, because they know that they couldn't do that or they didn't do that when they were in the classroom. So they're kind of jealous. They don't want to be outshined, by somebody that's doing something incredible. And then the other thing is just control. Maybe they feel like if everybody does the exact same thing, then everybody can be equally failing. Because if there's one teacher that does their own thing, so to speak, and excels, that's going to expose the fact that what they're trying to make everyone else do is ineffective and ridiculous. So they've got to kind of like stomp out all of the lights and just have this dull conformity that everybody has to follow. And it is beyond frustrating.
Beyond frustrating, because I found that the scripted curriculum, I think it simply did not meet the needs of not particularly gifted students. And often it didn't even meet the needs of the regular students either. It did not encourage making connections with their own life's experiences, particularly military kids. We have very, very unique challenges, and they're a very, very unique group. Frequent moves, parents away on duty, and then going back to the time of Iraq, Afghanistan, those that also even Kosovo when I started teaching, and there were years there was no military sponsors at all. It was just the families on base, and but these children are so worldly and so resilient. I mean, I grew up in the system. I went to 13 different schools, including 3 high schools. I didn't think anything of it. And I had the opportunities to travel. These kids have so many opportunities to travel. And they really have a lifestyle that most people really don't understand, because they can't understand the frequent moves and losing friends. That was an issue, but it seemed like they always made new friends once they got to the next base. But they was an extremely resilient, very sophisticated group.
Definitely. And I'm just kind of curious, just in education as a whole, I know that you mentioned Common Core. What do you think are some of the ways that you've seen education go downhill and be compromised over the last several decades?
I think eventually over, again, the critical literacy. In other words, when I went for my master's program as a reading specialist, it was a whole language approach where we integrated the printed word with experiences. That is not the case anymore. And towards the end with the Common Core, it was just skills, worksheets. It wasn't bringing in outside sources to supplement what they're reading. When I did that was probably the big thing right there, is limiting the curriculum. It's starting to become, to me, it was a form of indoctrination. It's leaving out key points, leaving out the reality. I think this has kind of gone downhill over the years. And that, over the years, there were times I had difficulties with that, and other times I was supported. And but I found ways to supplement the guidelines and the curriculum and the reads with bringing in more sophisticated materials to supplement and to challenge. This is what, and I thought it was absolutely necessary. Again, the sneak teaching.
So I'm curious, what has been your experience with toxic work environments or just unsustainable situations that had an impact on your mental or physical health?
I think my last 3 years in DoDEA, when this new principal came on board. One we had previously was wonderful. She left you alone. She didn't always agree with what you did, but she just left you alone to do your job. And it was always positive. And I don't even recall any parent complaints with the previous principal. And that, but I think that where it's become toxic is because we're moving in the direction of coercive control. It's becoming more like totalitarian countries where when schools are now becoming run from top to the bottom as through fear, intimidation, and punishment. This is what I experienced. It happened before, but not enough that I was even that concerned about. This last 3 years, we're bringing in people tattling on each other. You're getting in trouble for doing your job and simply offending. So it is always spying and tattling. So it became very, very coercive. If you were called in, you're going to be written up. My file probably must be 6 inches thick by now. So toxic means that it's a divide and conquer situation. People are not truly collaborating and working together in the best interest of students because they're afraid. And they were supported by the administrator to bully selected staff members who were not going along with their program. One of the things that might have contributed to this, when I taught, I dressed very stylish. I was one of the few people who did. And that may have contributed to this because I was seen as different. But as a gifted educator, I thought differently, and that I could not handle these worksheets, answer the questions. I wanted more interaction, and I'm afraid we're starting to move into AI teaching. I think the technology has also had a lot to do with this as well. Kids are so computer savvy, and that adds to the toxic work environment because they're misusing the computers. We had to keep an eye on that. But I think what made it really toxic was the coercive control by administration. It was moving in that direction.
Absolutely. And this seems to be such a universal problem. I feel like almost every single person that I've talked to that's been a teacher has some awful experience with administrators or instructional coaches. And it's hard because I know that there's great principals out there. You even mentioned having one. And so I just wonder why this is so prevalent in education. Do you have any theories about why in education in particular this is so normalized?
Well, there's a lot of, I think some blame COVID. I don't really see, how can we blame COVID? I mean, COVID's gone, but it seems like that there was a big change afterwards. And I think this has started from the top where they seem to hire principals. Not all of them. There are a lot of good ones out there. And I have had more good ones than bad ones. And that seemed the idea of you just could not win against it with these people. They seems like that they seem to have all their bases covered. Teachers are not supported when they were treated poorly for doing their job, and there was no consequences for the principal. And in fact, it sounded like that the upper management was saying, keep up with what you're doing.
So do you think it's the lack of oversight basically that's making principals kind of go rogue and be like dictators of small countries?
Yes. In fact, I am a certified coach, and even though I'm retired, I still consider myself a teacher, even if I'm not in any school system right now. I'm a certified coach, and I help teachers who are in this situation and to help them work through this. And I'm going to be working towards a second master's degree in a program called the Psychology of Coercive Control. It's offered by the University of Salford in the UK. And that this is a very much needed, this is a new field. And then so it'll improve, I will be a better coach, that I understand the situation better. And having experienced it myself, I fully understand it. I'm not sure what did they have to gain by hiring rogues as principals, but I'm hearing more and more stories all the time. Former colleagues, those that are still teaching, not only in DoDEA, but also other school systems, how they've been poorly teachers and poorly treated. And I think that the ones who are targeted are the best teachers, the most talented.
Wow. And so where do you see education going maybe in the next 20 years? Do you think that things are going to continue to get worse? And how do you think that will affect the future of students once they get out of the system?
Well, I think that we're moving in the direction. This is what I've heard of AI teaching. I think they're implementing this in one school system in Texas, and they're quite happy with it. So students start from where they are. They sit in front of a screen. It's just supervised by a monitor, and that they don't have enough information yet to determine how effective it is yet. But that's the direction we're moving in. AI, and that's sad, because I think students need a teacher to interact with. But I think that I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. But here's hope. West Virginia has now passed legislation giving teachers more control of their classes. This will go into law. This will be effective this coming school year. So hopefully other states will follow. And I am a citizen lobbyist for passing legislation to end workplace bullying. So in fact, there is something they're working on called the Workplace Bullying Accountability Act. Hasn't had much success here. It's hard to convince legislators to fully understand the seriousness of this and how this behavior, particularly in schools, is impacting students. And also the Healthy Workplace Bill. It's going to hold employers accountable for their workplaces, maintaining a healthy workplace. So this is so we have a serious problem on our hands. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But I think eventually there will be a shift at some point. They see how bad it is. They have to hit rock bottom.
Yeah. And I'm curious, what do you think are the ingredients of a good principal from your experience and what you've seen?
Oh, I've had wonderful principals, and I think one in particular, a couple of them, where they let you do your job, they trust you to do your job, they trust you to teach to the standards and bring in the materials that you see fit to run your classroom. They support you on that. They're not micromanaging. They leave you alone, and they set a limit to meetings. And to me, the ones that they have compassion for teachers, particularly if they have been teachers before. They leave you alone. They trust you to do your job. They're pleasant to be around, and they're very approachable. You can, if you needed to talk to them about anything, they're very approachable, and their door is always open. But with the good principals, we really didn't need to visit them in the office that much. They were too busy running a good school.
And I'm kind of curious, what kind of advice would you have for a teacher that feels like they're in a toxic workplace right now? They feel like maybe some of their coworkers are ganging up on them and creating rumors. They feel like their principal is either, letting them be bullied or doing the bullying. What would you advise for a teacher in that situation?
Well, my advice to them is to make sure they document everything and say, in DoDEA, you cannot leave. You cannot, there was no transfer program. You are stuck. And so is to simply find time for themselves, think of activities that uplift them, and to pursue those interests outside of school. Document, make sure you comply with all the rules there, making sure all the deadlines are met, And then if there becomes a situation where they could be let go, then they have the legal protection. Because there are some, even though it doesn't seem that way, but there are certain due process regulations in the contract. But to document everything, pursue outside interests, get out and travel. We live overseas, get out there and travel and do things. So just document everything, say as little as possible. Don't defend yourself verbally. Don't get into any kind of power play. And then to start consider looking for another job. Get certified in some other areas.
That's really great advice. And I just love to ask as many teachers as I can, if you had a magic wand and you could change just one thing in education, what would you change?
I think the big thing I would change is to let teachers do their jobs, trust teachers to do their job. In fact, that there has to be policies where teachers are respected, and that doesn't mean we have to agree on everything. If parents come in and if they want to, if they have an issue with the teacher, go to the teacher first. In other words, open communication, resolve issues before they become big problems. I think that if we're allowed to do that, in fact, the majority of parents that had issues with me, they were resolved just through dialogue. So in other words, let teachers do the job that they have been hired to do, and simply trust them because they know what's best for students. And it's not just about test scores. It's also developing as a human being, understanding and basically also human rights as well. I think we need to really be citizen lobbyists to end workplace bullying or coercive control. Really learn about it. And I think this is probably the essence of the challenge books that I used, because it was about coercive control, the dangers of coercive control, the impacts of it. And those in power didn't like that. I don't buy the argument that, well, it's not age appropriate, it's the language. That's not it at all. It's the message in all of those books. So allow us kids to read quality literature, not always be in front of a screen, interact, Socratic seminars, encourage diverse input. That's the no one size fits all. Really encourage diverse input. Administrators need to listen to the teachers and collaborate to work out problems.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Miss Betty Roberts. This has been an amazing and inspiring discussion. And I just want to thank you for your service of over 50 years in the educational world. I am sure that you have touched so many students' lives. And even if there were people that were too afraid to defend you, I'm sure that a lot of teachers were inspired by you and maybe took some of your sneak teaching, ideas and implemented them in their own classroom. So thank you so much, Betty. And audience, thank you so much for watching. If you ever want to interview with me, you can email me at teachertherapytrish@gmail.com. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and we'll see you guys next time.